So I'm very happy to welcome today Professor Martin Kusch to his Grande Conférence aux Archives Poincaré. Martin Kusch is professor in applied theory of science and epistemology in the Department of Philosophy of the University of Vienna. After studying philosophy in Finland, he received his doctorate from Hindica in Boston with a thesis on a language as calculus versus language as universal medium, a study in Husserl, Heidegger, and Gadamer. Visiting in Toronto, in Auckland, in Edinburgh, and in Cambridge, he was professor at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge until 2009. He refused then a professorship in Constance, because Gerhard is here, but accepted one in Vienna. Martin's wide-ranging contributions to philosophy reflect both systematic and historical interests and cut across traditional disciplinary divides. He has published in the Philosophy of the Social Sciences, Epistemology, Philosophy of Language and Mind, Philosophy of the Natural Science, Philosophy of Technology, and a history of German and Austrian philosophy. In addition, he has written on the history of science with a special reference to the history of German psychology. In 2005, he delivered the Leibniz lecture at the Leibniz University, Hanover. He is member of the Academia Europaea and of the International Institute for Philosophy. One of his most famous books is Psychologism, a case studies in the sociology of philosophical knowledge in 1995. In another work, he defended Kripke's Wittgenstein. In 2013, he received an REC advanced grant on the emergence of relativism, historical, philosophical, and sociological perspectives. One of its aims is to explore the development of relativist motifs, especially in the 19th and early 20th century German language, culture, and science, in terms of the history of ideas. And Martin's lecture today on Simmel stands in this framework, which is very ignored, an ignored field in the French tradition of the most analytic philosophy. All the more we are curious about your talk. Thank you very much, and you and yours.
Thank you so much, Gerhard, for this very kind introduction. And thank you all very much for coming. Can you hear me? You can hear me properly? Okay, fine. Okay, so my talk is entitled Georg Simmel's Relativism, Proto-Analytic Epistemology, Genealogy, and Jewish Philosophy. Georg Simmel's work on various forms of relativism is both one of the most original and one of the least known contributions to early 20th century German language philosophy. In this paper, I shall try to offer a new interpretation of Simmel's relativism, focusing mainly on his opus magnum, the Philosophie des Geldes of 1900s. My interpretation has two parts corresponding to Simmel's two rather different projects vis-à-vis relativism. First, Simmel's defense of epistemic relativism in terms roughly familiar from analytic philosophy. And second, Simmel's attempt to justify relativism genealogically by showing that it is the natural outcome of developments in the natural and social sciences, as well as in financial capitalism and the modes of thinking it encourages. The second project, the genealogy of relativism, as I shall call it, is, amongst other things, a response to two highly influential tropes in 19th and early 20th century German and Austrian anti-Semitism. To wit, that the Jews are responsible for anything goes relativism on the one hand, and ruthless capitalism and socialism on the other hand. Simmel turns these tropes around. The Jewish relativist philosopher and social theorist is perfectly placed both to analyze the problems of the modern economy and culture and to offer a way of escaping some of its problematic effects. In this way, Simmel, at least implicitly, presents relativism as a key pillar of Jewish philosophy. But the first question I should address, I'm sure in this audience as well as on other forums, is the question, who was Georg Simmel? Well, he was born in 1858, a Protestant of Jewish descent. He did his PhD in 1880 in Berlin on Kant. In 1883, he did his habilitation in philosophy, also on Kant. He was a very successful teacher in Berlin. In 1900, Simmel became an unpaid extraordinary professor in Berlin. And in 1914, at the age of 56, he finally got a professorial chair in philosophy in Strasbourg. And in 1918, he died of cancer. He was a very prolific writer, publishing on many topics in philosophy and sociology. And in 1912, there was also a collection of his papers, Mélange de Philosophie Relativiste, published in France. Okay, I now turn to my rational reconstruction of what I call Simmel's Proto-Analytic epistemology, more precisely his defense of epistemic relativism in chapter 1, part 3 of the Philosophy of Money. Simmel's discussion of relativism in this book was widely noted in German-speaking philosophy at the time, sometimes praised, more often dismissed without any detailed argument. In discussions post-World War II, Simmel's defense of epistemic relativism was noted and discussed almost exclusively by sociologists or philosophers specializing in Simmel. Mills in 2009 and Steitzinger 2015 have tried to relate Simmel's arguments to contemporary debates in epistemology, and here try to push these lines of arguments further. I reconstruct this chapter as a series of arguments meant to suggest that relativist thinking naturally emerges in very different types of epistemology. To this end, Simmel discusses forms of foundationalism, coherence theory, evolutionary epistemology, and what one might call stance pluralism. Although Simmel mentions no one by name, his reflections on relativism are clearly motivated by attacks on relativism, and especially psychologism and historicism, in contemporaneous writings by authors like Husserl and Windelband. Inter alia, Husserl and Windelband attacked the idea that psychology and history can supply empirical support for relativism, i.e. that psychology discovers an irreducible variety of forms of cognition, or that history identifies a plurality of divergent cultures. Husserl and Windelband answer with variations on the ancient self-refutation charge. Either the claims of psychology and history are themselves absolute, or they are merely relative. If they are absolute, then the project of dissolving absolutes is doomed from the start. But if they are merely relative, then there is no reason to accept whatever psychology or history tell us. Simmel begins his discussion with forms of foundationalism, and he relates them to the regress of epistemic justification, familiar from skeptical arguments. To evaluate a given sentence S as true and epistemically justified, we need to draw on criteria, C1, that, at least when involved in the evaluation of S, are not themselves epistemically evaluated. Of course, these C1 can then be subsequently epistemically evaluated in a further step. But then we need further criteria C2 for the evaluation of C1. And it is easy to see how a regress results. For the evaluation of any given C1, one needs C1 plus CI plus 1. Absolutes. Simmel is well aware that anti-skeptical and absolutist epistemologies do not accept such analysis. They insist that the series of justifications must end eventually with absolute foundations if there is to be justification at all. Note in passing that essentially this argument can still be found in Paul Boghossian's sphere of knowledge. And Simmel seeks to undermine this absolutist view. First, Simmel denies that we can ever imagine what it would be like to have a C absolute. We only ever have had experience with CI that in principle stand in need of further justification. Second, even if there were a C absolute, our knowledge of it could only ever be fallible. Simmel appeals to a pessimistic induction on the history of candidates for the status of C absolutes. Principles regarded by one historical period as absolutes have invariably proven false or unjustified in later times. Third, relativism must be distinguished from skepticism. Skepticism introduces the regress of epistemic justification in order to establish that there is no epistemic justification at all. In their argumentation, skeptics thus accept absolutist standards. They agree that justification requires a C absolute. But Simmel's relativists reject this assumption. In our actual epistemic practices in everyday life and science, we are satisfied with local justifications, with, as Simmel says, relative series of derived proofs. Simmel tries to make all this plausible with a physical analogy. A proposition concerning the movement of some object O is always relative to some frame of reference, FRI. And there's always room for asking how O and FRI are located within a wider frame of reference, FRI plus 1. This series can in principle continue until we reach the endpoint of the universe in its totality. But this is not, of course, a framework with which we can operate in our attributions of movements on Earth. Still, our lack of grasp of the universe as a frame of reference does not prevent us from attributing movement to earthly sub-objects. Fourth, and finally, Simmel also appeals to relativistic themes in contemporary legal debates. He says every legal content, quote, only has that temporal validity which historical circumstances and change allow it to have. Of course, a popular theme in the contemporaneous historicism. As Simmel has it, talk of an absolute legal system is justified only as a, quote, symbol of our fallibility in legal reasoning. There's always room for changes that we take to be improvements. Although Simmel's lengthy discussion, of which I've here only offered the bare bones version, was original, it was not without intellectual depths and influences. I haven't got time really to go into details here. I can only summarily refer to the English language debate over the relativity of knowledge and the possibility of absolute axioms, a debate in which Hamilton, Mansell, Spencer, and Mill were the central figures. Echoes of their ideas can also be found in the next two steps of Simmel's overall arguments. But before going there, let's turn briefly to the perspectives of 21st century epistemology and note that there are authors today as well who claim that the skeptical problem of the criterion is the most important weapon in the arsenal of relativism. Howard Zenke, 2010, takes the relativists to respond to the problem of the criterion as follows. First, that all justification of beliefs is relative to our existing epistemic standards. Second, that these standards cannot be justified. And third, that we are entitled to simply accept them as given without justification. And of course, Henri has little trouble showing that this view has many counterintuitive implications. Simmel, it seems to me, deals the relativist a better hand. The Simmelian relativist does not assume that epistemic norms are without justification, just with merely relative justification. Simmel's response to the skeptical problem of the criterion, insofar as it appeals to the regress of justifications, is indirect rather than direct. In other words, he argues that the skeptical train of thought is based on a false rendering of justification, to wit, that all epistemic justification is linear and based on the possibility of an absolute foundation. Let us now turn to Simmel's relativist rendering of the coherence theory of epistemic justification, or in Simmel's own words, his reflections on epistemic circularity and epistemic interaction. Simmel begins by saying that we tolerate circles in epistemic justification as long as these circles are wide and as the circles are crisscrossing. It is the crisscrossing that interests Simmel in particular. It motivates his emphasis on epistemic interaction. Such interaction, he says, is, quote, mutuality of justification, that we get from any point in our knowledge of the world to any other points by way of justifications. Although Simmel does not use the term coherence at all, his notion of epistemic interaction fits nicely with Lawrence Bourgeois' 1985 key demand for coherence, namely that it be closely tied to the idea of mutual derivability in a system. We can in fact use Bourgeois' book and its criteria to measure degrees of epistemic interaction and locate Simmel relative to some other views. So according to Blanchard, in a fully coherent system S as a whole can be derived from every judgment of S. According to Ewing, in a fully coherent system S, every proposition can be derived from the rest of the system. Of course, as you well all know, Bourgeois rejects Blanchard's account as demanding too much of coherence. And he objects to Ewing that his coherence does not go far enough. It only demands that any given judgment must be derivable from a subset of S. It seems to me that Simmel's proposal is tantamount to Bourgeois'. Bourgeois insists that in a fully coherent system, every one of its constituent judgments must be derivable from the rest, such that all the others are relevant. And Simmel says that every judgment is connected by relations of epistemic justification with every other judgment. In support of his view, Simmel again offers a physical analogy. Beliefs have their positions within our system of beliefs on the basis of epistemic relations of justification, just as material masses have their position in the universe on the basis of their gravitational relations to all other bodies. Ultimately, every physical event has effects on every other, however small. And Simmel wants to say something analogous about beliefs and epistemic relations of justification. Coherence theories are, of course, often criticized for their alleged relativist consequences. Take what one might call the raft objection to coherence theories coming from Ernest Sosa and in a different form from John McDowell. The basic idea is to think of our beliefs as tied together by relationships of derivability or justification in the way in which pieces of wood are tied together to form a raft. The question then is, how is your raft of beliefs moored to or anchored in the ocean of sensory experience? Moreover, the worry is, could there not be multiple rafts each equally meeting epistemic criteria of coherence and interaction. And wouldn't that be relativism? Simmel turns this argument on its head. He thinks epistemic relativism is supported by the fact that the coherence theory, just like linear forms of epistemic justification, have implicit or unacknowledged relativist commitments. Up to this point, Simmel has considered what we today would call internalist theories of epistemic justification. In the third step of his overall argument, he turns to epistemic externalism, and especially to versions of evolutionary epistemology. Simmel's discussion of the issue in the Philosophy of Money is an abridged version of an earlier paper entitled On the Relationship Between the Theory of Selection and Epistemology of 1895, arguably the first paper in evolutionary epistemology. I shall here follow the paper up to the point where the Philosophy of Money begins to diverge from it. Simmel begins by outlining a view of evolutionary epistemology he rejects. I shall call this view Darwinian realism. Darwinian realism holds that in the struggle for survival, those species prevail that most accurately or truthfully represent the world. And from the fact that many of our own actions are successful in that they lead to feelings of satisfaction, the Darwinian realist concludes, by inference to the best explanation, that many of our mental representations must be accurate and true. Simmel proposes an error theory for Darwinian realism. He says, we sometimes find ourselves with conscious mental states, the contents of which are states of affairs giving us satisfaction. And when that occurs, we are inclined to search for the causes of these mental states. But we do so, he thinks, guided by the naive idea of, quote, morphological identity, unquote. That is the idea that the cause must be like the effect. In the present context, if the effect is a mental representation of a state of affairs, then so must be the cause. And thus we conclude that successful actions are made possible by accurate representations. Simmel answers with an argument, the central premise of which is epiphenomenalism about conscious mental states. Conscious mental states do not have causal powers. What has causal power, Simmel insists, are the unconscious psychological, physiological forces of which conscious episodes are but partial and temporary reflections. Overall, Simmel's alternative to Darwinian realism is then that evolution breeds perceptual and cognitive faculties, producing psychological, physiological forces, resulting in states that are satisfying and fitness increasing. And note that this account makes no reference to accurate representations as causes. I call Simmel's alternative to Darwinian realism, Darwinian anti-realism. To get it clearer in focus, distinguish between an internal and an external perspective on the epistemic system, consisting of our beliefs, their sources, our epistemic methods and criteria. Darwinian anti-realism is an external perspective on our epistemic system as a whole. Its central claim is that this epistemic system as a whole is not true in the sense of the correspondence theory of truth. Still, our epistemic system as a whole has been bred by evolution, and it is practically true in that it enables our species to be successful in evolutionary terms. This terminology of practically true goes back to the famous paragraph 26 of Hermann von Helmholtz's classic Handbuch der physiologischen Optik, where von Helmholtz writes, quote, The only sense in which our sensory presentations can be said to be true is practical. But while truth as correspondence does not apply from the external perspective, it is a legitimate concept of truth for Simmel in the internal perspective, the perspective from within an epistemic system. And Simmel seeks to support this bifurcation, internal versus external, by invoking the contemporary debate over the justification of geometrical axioms and logical principles. He insists that the axioms of geometry cannot be proven in geometrical ways, and that the laws of logic cannot be proven in logical ways. Moreover, that these axioms and laws seem intuitive and obvious to us, he says, indicates that they are elements of the overall cognitive perceptual system selected by evolution. Simmel advertises as the main advantage of Darwinian anti-realism that it overcomes the dualism of need and belief or action and belief. All three are, quote, determined by the same practical forces according to evolutionary necessities. Simmel is well aware of the fact that Darwinian anti-realism is committed to a version of relativism. Since the need of other species of animals are different from ours, these other species also have different systems of perception and cognition. So much for the 1895 paper. We can now return to the philosophy of money. There, the main novelty compared to the 1895 paper is the so-called normative firmness of certain truths. Given our constitution, quote, it is fixed ideally what is truth for us. This allows Simmel to say that, quote, the law of gravity remains true whether we come to know it or not. Now, it is not clear, though, how firm these truths are in the end for Simmel. For later in the Philosophie des Geldes, Simmel writes, quote, since human Geist undergoes a development, albeit slow and unnoticeable, there can be no law valid at a given moment that would be outside of the transformation in the course of historical periods, unquote. In light of this passage, the firmness of truth has to be indexed to time. The passage also suggests that Simmel's epistemic systems do not just vary with species and their biological evolution. They also vary with populations within a given species and their cultural developments. Note also that the laws in the quoted passage are unqualified. That suggests to me that Simmel was here thinking of laws in their broadest sense, including laws of nature insofar as they concern humans, psychological laws of thought, and logical laws. This reading certainly fits with Simmel's later writings. Evolutionary considerations have, of course, been used both as a support for absolutism and as defenses of relativism, say by Bloor or Stitch. The unique feature of Simmel's position seems to me the way in which he combines his relativistic externalist evolutionary epistemology with his internalist theory of interaction regarding epistemic justification within a system of beliefs. One might say that with this move, Simmel tries to offer a relativist solution to Sosa's raft problem. The system of beliefs does have a basis in sensory experience, and the foundations of the system are practically true, not because the system mirrors an independent reality, but because it leads to successful action as far as the satisfaction of needs is concerned. Of course, this does not bracket the relativism. Different practical needs, different systems of beliefs that justify each other in system internal ways. As I've argued elsewhere, Simmel's remarks on evolutionary epistemology clearly put him in the vicinity of pragmatist philosophy. And indeed, some American pragmatists showed an interest in Simmel. In a letter to Hugo Münsterberg, William James in 1905 wrote that, quote, wrote that he had read Simmel's, quote, original pragmatistic article, which seemed to me rather crude, though essentially correct. In the fourth step of his investigation, Simmel develops a form of relativism that holds not between epistemic systems, but within them. To distinguish the two forms, I shall speak of this new form as relativistic pluralism. Simmel's discussion of this view is related to Kant's transcendental dialectic on the one hand, and also to Hans Weihinger's fictions on the other hand. Both Weihinger and Simmel find it important, in Simmel's words, to transform constitutive principles that express the essence of things once and for all into regulative principles that merely are perspectives for progress in knowledge seeking. In consequence, Simmel urges us to employ all fundamental epistemic principles and philosophical positions as if they were true, that is, regulatively, heuristically, and as presupposing one another. Simmel is particularly interested in pairs of seemingly opposed principles and positions, such as inductive historical versus deductive mathematical methods in economics, metaphysical monism versus pluralism, foundationalism versus coherence theory in epistemology, and relativism versus absolutism. In light of the earlier steps, it might seem surprising that Simmel counts relativism and absolutism amongst the mutually dependent, only as if valid principles. Does he not thereby simply void the whole of the previous discussion? To see why not, we have to turn to the problem of self-reference. Simmel insists that prima facie, every epistemology has a problem with self-reference. The clearest case is skepticism. Its essential claim is A, all knowledge is uncertain. Is A uncertain? If the skeptic answers no, then A is refuted. If he reacts with yes, then it is at least unclear why skeptics should accept A. Simmel identifies similar problems with other epistemologies. Take dogmatism, that is epistemic foundationalism with indubitable basic beliefs. The essential claim is B, all knowledge ultimately rests on an indubitable foundation. Here too one can ask, is B based on such foundation? If no, then according to B, B is not knowledge. But a yes seems a strange reply as well. How can a statement stating the existence of indubitable foundations not itself be indubitable? According to Simmel, such problems always arise as soon as we assent to radical forms of meta-knowledge, that is, epistemic perspectives on our knowledge as a whole. The question then arises, is our radical meta-knowledge part of our knowledge or not? If not, then radical meta-knowledge is not knowledge. But if it is part of our knowledge, then it is not truly meta. Simmel holds that only relativism as an epistemic policy alongside absolutism as an epistemic policy can avoid these problems of self-reference. As an epistemic policy, relativism is defined by its goal, namely C. Everything which appears to be absolute is to be shown to be relative, historically, content-wise, psychologically. Can C avoid problems with self-reference? Can C be taken as relative? Simmel answers yes to both questions. C is relative since, as suggested above, it requires as its pendant the heuristic of absolutism, namely, everything relative has to be shown to be dependent about something which is absolute. At the same time, the mutual dependence of C and D shows the correctness of relativism. Relativism qua pluralist theory of epistemic policies can explain why both positions are important. Moreover, Simmel believes, and this he takes to be an argument against the self-refutation charge, that relativism qua pluralism of epistemic policies, quote, overcomes the alternative to either reject or accept the absolute. Relativism qua heuristic aims to show that what seemed absolute is merely conditional and relative. But relativism proceeds piecemeal, without making global claims for and against the absolute. Simmel's pluralism of epistemic principles and philosophical dualisms resonates with some views advocated today. Perhaps the most obvious contemporary parallel is Bas van Frazen's idea that philosophical positions are best taken as stances or policies. Other than dogmas, stances are defined primarily not in terms of beliefs, but in terms of values, goals, and research strategies. It is an important element of this conception that stances can more easily coexist than dogmas, and that they are hard to refute. Van Frazen rightly recognizes Wilhelm Dilthey as an important precursor of his theory. But Simmel also, and all the more to me, deserves this status. Up to here in the paper, I have tried to show that Simmel's argumentative arc in proto-analytic philosophy contains a wealth of ideas and insights, which later in different contexts have been discovered or rediscovered and systematically developed. Needless to say, Simmel has not succeeded in formulating any of his ideas in a way that would survive in the court of contemporary philosophy as such. But perhaps that should not be expected in the first place. Still, there remains something to be learned, I think, from the way in which Simmel ties together relativist elements from different types of epistemology. I now turn to the second part of my paper, Simmel's genealogy of relativism. In step one, I illustrate how a Jewish identity was foisted upon Simmel. In step two, I explain two central anti-Semitic tropes that are important for understanding Simmel's genealogy. In step three, I reconstruct Simmel's genealogy of relativism and modern capitalism and the role of Jews in both. I compare Simmel's rendering to that of the anti-Semites' views on these topics. And finally, in step four, I ask in what sense the material presented makes Simmel a Jewish philosopher. First then, Simmel's Jewishness or alleged Jewishness. Note, first of all, that Simmel never explicitly identified himself as a Jewish philosopher, or indeed as a Jew. It must also be mentioned that Simmel sometimes could even sound somewhat anti-Semitic. For example, in a letter to Rickert, Simmel wrote in 1906, quote, "The Jewish way of thinking is generally very different from the Germanic, and one shouldn't let the Jewish one dominate." Although Simmel himself did not identify as a Jew, his social environment always insisted on such identification. Gershom Scholem reports that Simmel was, quote, "generally regarded as the quintessence of a Talmudic thinker." Being regarded as Jewish invariably triggered anti-Semitic slurs and biases. Just how prevalent anti-Semitism was in those days can be gleaned from the comments of people who regarded themselves as Simmel's friends. Max Weber's wife, Marianne, for example, who admired Simmel's work, characterized him in her memoirs as follows. She says, he was, quote, "typically Jewish, ugly," unquote. And Rickert, whose favorite student, Emil Lusk, was Jewish, found it, quote, hilarious that colleagues discreetly inquire about the size of Simmel's nose. Just how nasty anti-Semitic attacks could be can be seen, for instance, in the case of the philosopher and graphology guru Ludwig Klages. He used the sample of Simmel's handwriting in his graphology textbooks and analyzed it as revealing, quote, an instinct-poor intellectualism which hides the flatness of the inner life under cheap rhetoric and intuition-free hair-splitting. Or when Simmel was considered for a professorial chair in philosophy in Heidelberg in 1908, Berlin historian Dietrich Schäfer wrote a secret memo to kill Simmel's chances. Quote, Simmel is an Israelite through and through, in his outward appearance, in his manners, and in his way of thinking. Simmel's view of life and world clearly differs from our German Christian classical Bildung. Simmel is, quote, corrosive, zersetzend, and negative, rather than able to lay foundations and to build upon them. He is, quote, geistreich and geistreichelt. Geistreich means something like intellectually sparkling, but superficial, and geistreichelt is geistreich, only worse. Even the economist and historian Gustav Schmoller, who was a crucial supporter of Simmel, wrote in correspondence that in the Berlin department, Simmel was regarded, quote, as a typically Jewish brooding mind, glinting in all colors, unfruitful because of sheer sophistry and shrewdness, unquote. To be fair, Schmoller was more positive when asked to write a character reference for Simmel in the context of the Strasbourg competition. Then he wrote, of course, there's no denying his Jewish background, but he belongs to the decent wing of Jewish academics. To sum up, even though Simmel did not himself emphasize his Jewish background, his environment did. And Simmel was often the victim of verbal anti-Semitic attacks. Typically, these painted him as sophistic, corrosive, and lacking in depth and intuition. Next, I shall briefly illustrate two important anti-Semitic tropes prevalent in the 19th and early 20th century German language literature. First, the trope linking relativism to Jewishness. And second, the trope tying Jewishness to the ills of modern financial capitalism. I highlight these two tropes here since Simmel's genealogy of relativism can be read as responding to both tropes. First then, relativism and Jewishness. To be more precise, it wasn't just relativism and relativism alone that anti-Semites linked to Jewishness. Rather, it was a bundle of negative philosophical views or judged negative philosophical views and isms. Relativism, nihilism, cosmopolitanism, cold and corrosive rationalism, and indifference to moral questions. All these, of course, circle around relativism. Here are snippets of such key anti-Semitic texts of the time. Jewishness is tantamount to, quote, social and political nihilism. Düring, the Hebrew has never gained knowledge of good and bad. Chamberlain, the Jewish mind decomposes and gnaws away our best. The historian von Treitschke, the Jews are, quote, an element of decomposition and champions of homeless cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism was another term often used to talk about relativism. Sombart, the Jewish mind is characterized by, quote, sophistry, lacking intuition, indifference, moral mobility, and mimicry. These passages are, of course, easily recognized as anti-Semitic. But not all authors were as open in their anti-Semitism. For example, Wilhelm Windelband wrote in 1884 that, quote, relativism is the philosophy of the blasé who does not believe in anything anymore, unquote. Contemporary readers would have had no difficulties in decoding this message. There was a well-established association between Jewishness and the blasé attitude. Let me conclude this brief overview of how anti-Semites link together Jewishness with relativism by quoting a couple of lines from an Austrian Nazi philosopher of 1942, commenting on Simmel's relativism as follows, quote, "Relativism is a symptom of decay. It is no surprise that it was a Jew, Georg Simmel, who represented it in its purest form." The second anti-Semitic trope claimed that the Jews are invaders, strangers, who ruthlessly dominate the economy, exploit the Gentile, undermine social order, and are responsible for economic crises. The Jews, quote, "deny and destroy the countries that they invade." Düring, the Jews dominate unfairly the medical profession, the economy, especially banking, the press, and thus public opinion. Parrott, economic policies in Germany serve the Jews and only the Jews. Glagau wrote of a, quote, "degenerate race which governs the earth by way of trickery, racketeering, and haggling." The highly influential historian von Treitschke saw the Jews as responsible for the economic crisis of the 1870s, the Gründerkrach. Allegedly Jewish bankers practiced reckless Manchestertum. But at the same time, von Treitschke also chastised the Jews for supporting socialism. Marx, Treitschke said, was, quote, "of Talmudic shrewdness." Accordingly, in his notorious paper, Our Prospects of 1879, Treitschke introduced the anti-Semitic slogan, "The Jews are our misfortune." It would later be at the bottom of every page of the Nazi journal Der Stürmer. Similar motifs could also be found in academic writings by early social theorists. Ferdinand Tönnies wrote that the Jews are traders, strangers. Their nature is fused with trade and thus with capitalism. They remain forever foreign. And Sombart added that the Jews, quote, "restlessness and ability to adapt makes them good journalists, lawyers, actors, and traders." Even Max Weber wrote of the, quote, "Jewish pariah capitalism that encouraged the exploitation of Gentiles." I can now return to Simmel and show how his genealogy of modern relativism turns the anti-Semitic tropes around by suggesting that it needs the Jewish relativist philosopher and social theorist both to analyze the problems of modern economy and culture and to identify a way out of some of the problems contemporary culture faces. The central contrast running through the Philosophie des Geldes is that between ancient and medieval understanding of money on the one hand and modern understanding of money on the other hand. Let's begin with the ancient and the medieval view. Simmel speaks of it as, quote, "the materialist conception of money," unquote. What made money money and thus valuable was thought to be the material out of which coins were made. Because money was conceptualized as a substance, its value was taken to be fixed. It followed that money could not function as a commodity. It could not be lent for interest, and that there was assumed to be a just price, a fixed price for everything. Simmel claims that the materialist conception of money was, quote, "a theoretical expression of a real sociological condition." For instance, what counted for the Greeks was, quote, landholding, the relatively non-detachable and law-protected substance, and that, quote, an agrarian economy with its reliability and with few and hardly variable intermediaries. Simmel suggests that the materialist and static conception of money was inseparable from, both supported by and supportive of, certain philosophical views, such as the metaphysical scheme of fixed substances and their essential and accidental properties, a static eternal cosmos and social organization, a philosophical thought focused on qualitative rather than quantitative categories, the conception of truth as adequatio rei et intellectus, he says, the metaphysical parallel of the just price doctrine, and, most importantly for our context, medieval and ancient metaphysics naturally led to the view that there are absolutes, truths or entities that are permanent, unchanging, and timeless, not dependent on anything else, and not relative to contexts. The modern, or as Simmel says, transcendental understanding of money differs fundamentally from its ancient and medieval predecessors. Adam Smith is credited with being the key figure in articulating the modern transcendental theory of money. Most human relationships are now thought of as relationships of exchange, and economic exchange is the basic building block of society. There no longer is a fixed just price for every kind of good. Instead, there is the market mechanism that temporarily turns numerous and different subjective preference into a specific price. The transcendental understanding of money also comes with or facilitates specific philosophical and scientific ideas. The two most important such ideas were calculation and relativity. Calculation first. The money economy invites the reduction of the qualitative to the quantitative. In the philosophical domain, this corresponds to, Simmel says, the rationalist worldview. It claims to be neutral, like money, and the high value given to calculation in almost all types of philosophy and in the sciences. And another key idea important for our context is relativity. The economic value of a good G is determined by its relations to all other Gs. What would I sacrifice, give up in order to get G? And no G has an economic value outside of exchange. It is in exchange that the economic value of an object is determined. Ergo, exchange is, quote, the economic historical realization of the relativity of things. Or in a different striking quote, money is nothing other than a specific form of the embodied relativity of economic goods that signifies their value. Just as the absolutist view of the world represents a definite stage of intellectual development in correlation with the corresponding economic and emotional conditions of human affairs, so the relativist view of the world seems to express the momentary relationship of adjustment on the part of our intellect. Relativism thus naturally goes together with the modern money economy and modern economic thought. Although Simmel does not mention it, the link he suggests between modern economics and relativistic thinking was no news at the time. It had already been insisted on since the 1850s by Karl Knies, who held that there are no permanent economic laws and that all economic thought has to be local and contextual. Knies explicitly contrasted absolutism and relativity. Here it's of course important to remember that Knies strongly influenced the whole generation of economists and social theorists, amongst them Schmoller and Weber. But it is not just economic thought and the money economy that have paved the way for relativist thinking. There's also a more indirect connection via natural science. Economic thoughts and the calculation-centered money economy have facilitated and supported the development of forms of natural science that replace substances and stability with movement and evolution, categories with laws, and intrinsic with extrinsic properties. And the history of the sciences shows that our forms of thinking can change radically over time. The Copernican revolution is Simmel's central example. Now, we today are, of course, accustomed to thinking that relativism undermines the authority of science, natural science in particular. Interestingly enough, this was not a view widely shared 120 years ago. At least in the German context, many scientists and philosophers regarded science as a force which destroys beliefs in absolutes of any kind. Finally, how do the Jews fit into the story of modernity and relativism? To answer this question, I consider, in addition to the philosophy of money, also the two most famous texts by Simmel that people have read, even if they've read nothing else by him, Die Großstädte und das Geistesleben and Der Fremde of 1903 and 1908, respectively. First of all, Simmel agrees with other observers that historically, the Jews have closer ties to money and money lending than other social groups. But whereas the anti-Semites explain these ties in terms of an alleged permanent Jewish character, Simmel offers a sociological account. One reason that outsiders in danger of persecution and expulsion have good reason when it comes to possessions to favor money over land, shops and industries. After all, money is easy to take with you when you suddenly have to flee. The fear of prosecution also explains why Jewish bankers demanded high levels of interest. They needed, says Simmel, a risk premium, since they frequently were robbed and driven away. Moreover, persecuted minorities tend to have only formal and distant relations with the majority. Monetary relations are a natural expression of such relations. Although Simmel does not make it explicit, even in medieval times, the Jews' understanding of money must have been close to the modern understanding. After all, the Jewish involvement with money did not support a substantivist rendering of money. In this sense, the Jews were modern before modernity. Simmel concludes that the focus on money and calculation must have left a mark on the Jewish mentality. It is more logical, calculative, rationalist, and formal than, he says, substantive, creative. Simmel also insists that Jews naturally paved the way towards secularization and atheism. This is because their concern with money, combined with their, quote, monotheistic schooling, made it easier for them to replace God with money. Second, Simmel also comments on the idea that the European Jews were or are strangers. He links the role of the stranger to that of the traveling trader, a link which connects the comments of the stranger with the monetary interests. Again, Simmel is concerned to point out that pointing out the suffering this role has often involved. The Gentiles failed to recognize the individuality of the Jews, acknowledging only a vague and abstract commonality of general human properties. And when there is social unrest, it is the strangers, the Jews, that are blamed. Simmel's comment on the Gründerkrach. But Simmel also stresses the fact that strangers can contribute something important to their surrounding cultures. Most importantly, since the stranger is not tied to the interests of the host culture, they make for more objective judges in legal disputes and make for more insightful social political observers. Third, although Simmel does not say so explicitly, it is naturally to read him as saying that Jews are paradigmatic or natural modern city dwellers, which was also a reality in Berlin. After all, in the modern city, everyone is a stranger to many others. The economy is governed by rationalism and money, and calculation is all important. Simmel highlights what he calls the reserve, repulsion, and distance between people in the city. He also claims that the blasé attitudes, remember Windelband, cosmopolitanism, moral indifference, and nihilism all result from the conditions of the modern city. Again, though, Simmel is not here going along with the anti-Semitic stereotype. He's not saying, as the anti-Semites would have it, that the Jews created the modern city in their image. He's rather saying that the Jews were shaped by the social political conditions imposed upon them. Fourth, and finally, the Jews and relativism. Again, here too, Simmel merely introduces the premises of his views, leaving it to his readers to draw the natural conclusion. Clearly, if the relativist worldview is the natural outcome of modernity, with its money economy, short and long distance trade, the modern city, and calculation, and if the Jews have been implicated and shaped by these conditions more than anyone else, then obviously the Jews are the natural relativists. What is more, as strangers, they are also able to objectively analyze the social world that surrounds them. Indeed, to be able to do so has been crucial to their survival in adverse conditions. And finally, and here I jump ahead to Simmel's later preoccupations with art and life, the Jews may also hold the key for us to learn how to survive in the conditions of modern life in the modern city. The key is to turn the social distance that comes natural to the Jews into a positive quality, a distance that allows us to escape the pathologies of modern life. Conclusions? Let me conclude with a comment on the relationship between Simmel's relativism and Jewish philosophy. I take the definition of Jewish philosophy from the editor's introduction to the 2007 Cambridge Companion to Modern Jewish Philosophy. Quote, modern Jewish philosophy has been and continues to be, whatever is the outcome of a multifaceted engagement between, on the one hand, thinking about issues relevant to understanding the Jewish condition or the meaning of Judaism and Jewish life, and on the other hand, philosophical thinking that is indebted to and responds to the tradition of modern Western philosophy. Admittedly, this is somewhat a weak understanding of Jewish philosophy, but let me comment on it anyway. By these criteria, I suggest Simmel is a Jewish philosopher. Simmel does reflect on, quote, issues relevant to understanding the Jewish condition or the meaning of Judaism and Jewish life. He responds to the tradition of modern Western philosophy by defending a form of relativism of which the Jews are natural proponents. And he does so as proto-analytic philosopher and as a genealogist, including as a genealogist of some of the darkest anti-Semitic sides of Western philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. Wow, that was amazing. Please, I would like just to say that in the meantime, I understood. I never read Simmel, so I was happy to discover him. But I also understood, but maybe it's a projection that is completely not justified and not about your own philosophy. I mean, this makes sense. So thank you really very much about to shedding some light to the reasons why anyway, very interesting. Gerhard, the floor is yours.
Well, I will admit that when I came across Simmel, and I only came across him some 4 or 5 years ago, actually. I'd never read any of his work before. It felt a bit like a kindred soul, because he has someone who is trying to bring together
Exactly.
a kind of a precision of argument in some respects with a broad historical and sociological perspective, and that somewhat resonated with me. Admittedly, that's true. Yes.
Yeah, I did. Of course, I didn't think that you were inspired by him. Of course not. But the links are.
No, absolutely. No.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy to admit it. I'm happy to admit it.
Very good, Gerhard.
Yes, so thanks very much for this stimulating talk. Very stimulating. I don't know Simmel too, but now if you consider the period around 1900, under Herbert Merton's perspective, modernist conservative, Simmel and Weinger were more conservative concerning the epistemology of science. Now, Simmel and Weinger were both in Strasbourg, and there is a clear resemblance with other proto-analytic philosopher, Henri Poincaré, and the movement Critique de la Science. Now, I asked me if perhaps Simmel could be influenced even by the French zeitgeist of secularism and conventionalism. Have you there some information on this?
Yeah, very good question. I don't think he was. I have not found in his writings. I mean, it's difficult to be sure, because one of the most annoying features of Simmel's texts is that he almost never cites anyone. So you have to work out who he is talking about. I mean, in part that was still typical of the time, but Simmel was worse than others. I mean, Weber and Rickert give you the occasional reference. Simmel almost never does it, so you have to work it out. Still, I mean, his letters and texts that he didn't intend to publish and excerpts he didn't so on give you some indication what he knew. And I don't really think he was familiar with the French philosophy. He was, of course, familiar with the early work of Durkheim and with French sociologists.
Yes,
so it could be that some of these French thoughts traveled to him via the French sociologists. That's, of course, a real possibility. But even then, it's not very marked in his text. And I think he was, as much as his thinking about relativism is concerned, I think he was much more influenced by the British discussion that I very briefly referred to, much more so than by the French context.
But nevertheless, I mean, if I hear that the geometry should not be justified by a geometrical reflection, but by evidence and so on. I mean, this is exactly, and by sense evidence, this is exactly Poincaré's position.
Yeah, no. I mean, let me put it this way: these sorts of ideas were. I mean, I'm a bit skeptical of I'm a little bit skeptical of the zeitgeist, but they could be found in many contexts. Also, of course, in the German context, you could find people picking up these ideas or then developing them. My general impression is that the French started, the two key figures that are important for Simmel are Durkheim from the French context, and then later Bergson. And that was really his connection to the French.
Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. There's a question from Giuseppe Nadoro. Giuseppe, the floor is yours.
Hi.
Hello.
You. Hello. This might as well be a question that is born out of ignorance of Simmel. So I was wondering. So I suppose the question is, what are the claims of relativism relative to, according to Simmel? And I think that at some point you said that the sort of contemporary philosopher that you think might be close to what you say is Van Frassen, and with his idea of stances. And so there's a kind of pragmatism there about the fact that perhaps different explanations for, are responding to, have different goals. So, and if one puts it that way, is that actually relativism in a sense? Because again, I'm not very familiar with the material, but I suppose I tend to think of relativism as, in a way, in the way in which perhaps Boghossian, or, how it is normally discussed, is the view that that a claim is, whether it is true or false, is relative to whether the person believes it to be true or false, or whether it's right and wrong is relative to whether the person believes it to be right and wrong. But on the other hand, the sort of claims that Van Frassen makes, it seems to me that it's not relativism in that sense. It's more like distinguishing between the kind of questions that one once answered and so on. So I just wonder whether Simmel is in what are the claims of relativism relative to? Are they relative to people? Are they relative to the goals of explanations? And clearly science would have different, say, epistemic values than or biology would have different epistemic values than chemistry or physics and so on. So I just wonder whether you could say something about that.
Sure. Thank you very much. No, very, very good question. Well, I would first like to begin by saying that I have discussed the question whether and to what extent Van Frassen should be counted as a relativist in a book that I published in January on relativism in the Philosophy of Science. There I tried to argue in what sense Van Frassen position is naturally rendered as a relativist view. Now, yes, of course, the key question is how charitably or how uncharitably do we characterize the relativist position? If one characterizes it like you were characterizing it, like the relativist is someone who says something is true because I believe it to be so, that's of course a silly form of relativism. And in that sense, Simmel is not a relativist, and almost nobody who ever counted himself a relativist, people like Bloor, people like Stitch, people like me, and a whole range of people who are relativists in ethics. None of them thinks something is true or justified simply because I believe it to be so. So rather the relativist says something like, and now you have different versions of relativism depending on how strong you make this claim, that the epistemic or moral or aesthetic standing or status of a claim is relative to a system of standards. There can be more than one such system of standards, and there is no absolute ranking of those standards. That would be one version of relativism. Boghossian immediately combines this with this equal validity idea, namely that all systems of standards are equally valid or equally true or equally justified. And that again immediately renders the relativism in such an implausible way that it's easy to shoot down. I mean, in recent years and in months, in my own case, a lot of people have tried to argue that we should not burden relativism with this equal validity view. Hartwig Field argues that, and so on and so forth. So let's not assume that Simmel is a relativist only if he takes such an implausible view. Rather, Simmel is a relativist in the sense that, and now let's go through these different versions. The first argument, that justification is always relative to a given context where one can break off on the basis of contextual determinants the justification. That was this first argument, the regress of justifications arguments, the argument he makes against the foundationalist. He's a relativist in the sense of he defends relativism in the sense of the coherence theory, that there could be more than one set of coherent beliefs. That's the second argument. He's a relativist in the third argument by suggesting that different species, different cognitive ways of processing the world, and there is no absolute correct way of connecting to the world. And he's a relativist in this fourth sense, in that he says there could be conflicting stances, conflicting principles on the basis on which one judges and on the basis of which one investigates. So there isn't like, Simmel nowhere gives like a three-line argument in the way in which Boghossian says a relativist has to say three things. Simmel is rather concerned to pointing out that in different forms of epistemology, different elements of a relativist view emerge. This is what he's arguing. I can't hear you.
Sorry, can I quickly come back? Or
yes, no, please.
Okay, so I oversimplified. Clearly, I shouldn't have stated that in such subjectivist terms. But nonetheless, one could say that the relativist claims that they believe that the standard is one that ought to be adopted. Yeah, and in that sense, one can reframe that the claim that I made in a very crude way by saying, well, I believe that these epistemic standards are the ones that have to be adopted. And in that case, the relativism is still relative to the person who holds the belief, not in a particular claim in this case, but to the standards which provide, I suppose, the internal justification for the claims. So I suppose, by rephrasing that question I wasn't quite sure, I suppose, whether the claim that Simmel is making is that, for example, when I have to adjudicate between different claims, when I have to provide different explanations, I appeal to different standards of evidence because, say, I'm a little bit like an Aristotelian and think that in different contexts, I have to use, I cannot expect as much precision from in moral matters as I can expect in mathematics. And I think that, there is a context there. And if I am a reasonable person, I have to adjust my standards of evidence and to the kind of context in which I'm operating. And so so my question is Simmel a contextualist in that sense, in the sense in which Aristotle might be deemed to make that kind of contextualist claim or is he at the end of the day a sophisticated relativist? And I'm trying to make the distinction here between, I suppose, explanatory contextualism and relativism. And is he a sophisticated relativist in the sense that in the end he claims that the standards of evidence, which clearly are not just have got to do with particular beliefs, but the standards of evidence are ultimately relative to whether one, or not one, maybe individual persons, but a culture and so on, holds them to be or believes them to be true. Because it seems to me that there is that distinction, and I take it that Van Frassen is more of a contextualist. I don't know his work very well, but I thought that he defended more a form of contextualism than perhaps relativism.
Okay, let's set Van Frassen aside.
Thank you for this chance, and thank you for the talk, Professor. So I had a question with regard to Simmel's view, or I was wondering whether he was sympathetic to Kant's ethics, to Kant's moral philosophy. I don't know if you know something about his stance on that.
Oh, Simmel. Well, he does have a lot to say about Kant. I mean, like almost every German philosopher of the time, he was, of course, trained on Kant. And I mentioned that his Habilitation and his dissertation were both on Kant. He wrote a book about Kant. He wrote an introduction to Moralwissenschaft, an introduction to moral science. The reference to the English context is obvious already from the title. And this book is a big fat book, and it has 150 pages just on Kant's categorical imperative, and is a detailed criticism of Kant's ethics. From at that stage, Simmel was very much a Spencerian naturalistic philosopher, and he criticizes Kant's ethics from that perspective. Later in his life, his criticism of Kant comes less from naturalized philosophy, but more comes from, how should I put it? He always sets opposite Goethe and Kant. And whereas Kant represents to him a kind of hyper-rationalist view of ethics, you might say that Goethe represents for him more like an, if you like an Aristotelian conception of ethics, an ethics less grounded in rationalist considerations of the consequences of an action, but more like in the moral, ethical person's way of finding intuitively almost the correct form of action in a given circumstance. So Simmel, one might say that at least a third of Simmel's work overall is concerned with ethics. And so if that interests you, yeah, there's lots and lots to read.
Yeah, I just wanted to know that if he was critical to Kant's work, because it sounded like that, but yes, he was. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. He's critical of Kant's theoretical philosophy, he's critical of Kant's moral philosophy, but he takes Kant extremely seriously. So he thinks, like, with respect to almost every philosophical problem, is you cannot go back behind Kant. You have to be able to argue your case against Kant before you can go anywhere else. That's sort of the baseline. Right.
Thank you.
Sure.
Wonderful. So we have another question about familiarity about the relationships with other philosophers. So Toussaint would like to know whether there's a link between the conception of relativism in Simmel's thought and the problem of truth in Heidegger. And what about Gadamer?
Yes. That's a very good question. Yes, there are all sorts of historical links between Simmel's work and later work. For example, Simmel was a key influence on Spengler's decline of the West, and many chapters in Spengler's book, although Spengler never refers with one word to Simmel, in fact pick up arguments of Simmel's Philosophie des Geldes. So there's a first link. Secondly, Simmel's last book is a discussion of philosophy of life, which he wrote in the last few months of his life in Strasbourg. And one of the chapters is about death. And Heidegger says in his lectures that this was a key influence on his analysis of death. So even though, Heidegger, for all his anti-Semitism, and probably would not have made a very public showing of his indebtedness to Simmel, does in fact acknowledge his debts to Simmel's analysis of death. Gadamer, I've done myself quite a bit of work on Gadamer. I don't think it's quite so obvious in Gadamer's case, because the things that Heidegger picks up on are really the existentialist bits in Simmel, and not so much the things that Simmel has to say about tradition, which he could also have picked up on, and the things that Gadamer could have picked on. But I think at some point the tradition simply was broken, because Simmel could not be read for all these years of the Nazi period, and he was already attacked so much during the Weimar Republic, so before World War II, that increasingly he fell out of public discourse in the 1920s increasingly.
Very interesting. So in the same spirit, someone would like to know whether Simmel's relativism was compatible. You answered to this question partially, but it would be great if we could dig a little bit into this, whether it was compatible with an ethical stance about how to live a good life. Very simply, what kind of ethics Simmel defended in maybe this last book you just quoted? Right.
The key chapter on ethics in the last book is called Das individuelle Gesetz, the individual law. And as the title suggests, the law concept here, of course, refers back to Kant, the categorical imperative as a law of morality, whereas the individual aspects refers again to Goethe. And the idea that Simmel tries to defend there is that there is a fundamental ethical right and a fundamental ethical duty to develop oneself as an individual. Developing one's individuality is itself one of the highest moral demands. The implication being that you can only be moral towards others if you first develop yourself in the way in which typical German thinker of the time, Goethe, developed his character. So, you know, when it might sound strange in a French context that Goethe was such a towering figure, but for much of the 19th century, of course, it was Beethoven in music and Goethe in literature, and Goethe's way of self-fashioning and Goethe's way of, so he was read, of consciously trying to make himself a maximally worthy human being through education became the ideal of the German middle classes. This became a moral as much as an intellectual idea. And it's this idea that Simmel tries to defend in that last chapter of his last book.
Thank you very much in the name of the person who asked the question. I would like to, if the question queue is has been cleaned now. Everyone was able to ask the question they wanted. So if there is something else, please go on. But I'll just use this opportunity to go back to something you said at almost the very beginning, when you said that Simmel himself made the distinction between German and Jewish mode of thinking or thinking. What did he mean, really? Well, because afterwards you gave so many quotations about Jewish whatever, the anti-Semitic quotations. And I suppose that his stance was not exactly the same, somehow not unrelated though. Could you say something?
I think, but it's always when one takes a quote out of context and say, look, he sometimes, and I was careful how I formulated it. I said sometimes he could even sound anti-Semitic. I think one should not give too much weight to what someone writes in a letter to someone he considered partly a friend, but also someone that he knew was well aware of Simmel's own Jewishness. So I could well imagine that him presenting the issue in that manner was very much owed to the person he was corresponding with. And that if we want to know what Simmel really thought and what he considered what he thought was his considered view, we better look to what he says in his published writings.
Sure. So this quote was rather a private joke to the person.
Well, I wouldn't say a private joke. Richard wasn't the person who was particularly funny or appreciated jokes. I would rather say it could have been that he thought this was the kind of thing that Richard would kind of like him to say. Remember also that even in his later text, you could say there was in some respect a distinctive Jewish way of thinking. Because if one puts together the bits that I said towards the end, there was a way of having to be maximally objective and neutral in your perspective on the social relation you find yourself in, because you need that in order to survive. So the stranger attitude, the objective stranger attitude, was as much a strategy of survival as it was a strategy of choice. Also what he described as like the Jewish calculative character, rationalist calculative, was owed to the economic circumstances the Jews were forced into. Right? So you could say that he does admit that there is a certain, of course, no determinism, but that there's a certain mode of thinking that he thinks Jewish intellectuals naturally gravitated towards. And it is striking how many early social theorists were in fact Jewish. So there's, you picked up on a theme that was occasionally remarked upon at the time, right? So there could even be a sense in which what he said to Rickert, in some way he meant, even though of course he didn't spell out to Rickert what was the sense in which he meant it.
Yeah, I was. Could you remind us when was it said? When these discussions are taking place exactly? Because I was just wondering, what is the relationship with? Did he speak about Zionism? Maybe because
Yes.
Because this is the moment where, I mean, it's hard to judge whatever he says about Jewishness at that time to our perception of it, in the sense that that Jews themselves were trying to understand who they are in very precise in order to be able to think about Zionism as a coherent political idea in response, in dialogue with the nation states, etc. So
absolutely. I mean, that's it. Is in fact some of these things I had to cut out because the paper was getting too long. I did have a quote on Zionism in it, because Simmel said in 1906, if I remember correctly, that Zionism is a crime, and that I mean, but that wasn't so unusual for like enlightened Germanophile Jews in Germany. That was quite a typical attitude to take.
In what sense a crime? Just
it was a crime against the historical task he saw of Jews and Europeans and Gentiles finding ways of living together. It was, I mean, to him, like as for many enlightened Germanophile Jews, it was a betrayal of all that Jews had fought for. So that's why I think it's a crime. I wanted to say something else on that. I mean, I will say he was very friendly with Martin Buber, for example, and he also published things in a book that Martin Buber edited. So he was quite friendly with Zionists. And in fact, Buber says, and I had to cut this quote as well, there was just one time ever someone heard Simmel refer to himself as a Jew. And this is when like Buber told him about his experience, what it is like to be a Zionist. And Simmel responded by saying, wir sind schon ein seltsames Volk. We are a strange people. And here the we referred to the Jews. That's the only time, allegedly, anyone has ever heard Simmel refer to himself as a Jew. So don't give it too much attention. I only mention it to emphasize that although he thought Zionism was a crime, he was perfectly happy to have Zionist friends and interact with them and publish in their journals and so forth.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating. Any remarks, questions, whatever? Because I could go on with this all the time. I see that Tasha wanted to ask something. Go on, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your conference. It's very good and very excellent. So my question was about the relation of Simmel with ethics, and you responded to it's very interesting because of the Goethe tracing, no? So the frame, the cultural framework, no, about Bildung, no,
yeah,
self-flourishing and self-realization, about flourishing the capacities and etc. But since you just mentioned Buber and that he was friends, then they were friends, maybe could you tell us a word about Simmel's view of thou, of you, of you and thou, yeah. And
oh, the ein thou. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think he has ever written about this. One could rather see the other way around, that there are certain themes and motifs in Simmel that might have influenced Buber. But I would have to do more research on this to give this more, to really be able to show that in detail. I don't know of any good study that looks at the relationship between. I mean, there's a journal called Simmel Studies that have very short papers. So you might find a 3-page paper, Buber and Simmel, which doesn't really tell you very much. So I think there is still an interesting paper to be written about that relationship. I haven't looked at that aspect in detail.
Or about the general idea of the relation of two persons, no? The ethical relations that maybe wonder about the Simmel writings of upon the woman of love. But I'm not an expert. I don't know very much about. I wonder if there would be something.
Well, I mean, this is one of the fascinating sides of Simmel, that he also is one of the early writers about men and women and the relationship between them and the power structures between them. Simmel also attended and wrote in the Social Democratic newspaper about the first Congress of German socialist women in Berlin in the 1890s, about women liberation from a socialist Marxist point of view. He actually attended that conference and wrote about it. However, so that's the good news. The bad news is that when you then read what Simmel writes about men and women, it is by our standards hopelessly essentialist. He thinks there is a male culture and a female culture, and the female culture is focused on the house, and the male culture is focused on the world. And of course, that doesn't sound too good from our perspective. What is quite intriguing about these texts, though, is that Marianne Weber, Max Weber's wife, was of course also an extremely smart thinker and philosopher sociologist. So she wrote then in Germany's leading philosophy journal, she wrote a critique of Simmel's views of male-female relations. And that exchange is still very much worth reading. And on that topic is also quite curious to mention that Simmel's own wife, who could not study in the university because women were not admitted in the university, but Simmel wrote to the rector of Berlin University so that his wife could attend at least Simmel's own lectures, which she then did so that she could take notes and Simmel could publish it. But so Simmel's wife writes a letter to Marianne Weber and says, well, Georg always wants me to take notes on his lectures. I really want to write my own books, which she then went on to do. So she wrote 4 books about art and religion and the situation of women. And now comes the final point of the story. Stefan George, the famous German poet, he said to his friends, there is one real philosopher in the Simmel family, and it's not Georg. So there you go. So there's lots of interesting things to be said about Simmel's views on gender. Of course, they are terribly dated, but in their own time, they're an interesting document.
So it looks like he was a relativist as far as the metaphysical foundations of the universe are concerned, but not as far as the social constructions are concerned, right?
Well, he did his most famous paper on the male-female thing is das Relative und das Absolute im Geschlechterproblem. The relative and the absolute in the problem of gender. And yes, there he puts a little bit too much on the absolute side and a little bit too little on the relative side. Absolutely.
Giuseppina wanted to add something. Giuseppina, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Sorry, if there is time. So I wanted to ask, it's just a really clarification question because I'm not sure I fully understood your answer. So you said that that Simmel claimed that dogmatism and skepticism, and presumably any foundationalist philosophy, has a kind of self-referential problem. Yeah. Yes. So the skeptic claims that knowledge is certain, but if it is true, there is a problem if it is not true, and the same with the dogmatist. Yeah. And then you said that relativism avoids that problem, but I suppose I couldn't quite catch what was Simmel's answer as to why relativism avoids that problem. Is that because it rejects the view that your metaphilosophical, I don't know what to call it, proposition or principle can be said to be true or false? So is he claiming that it doesn't make any sense to apply the notion of truth and falsity to your meta level principles? Or if that's not the claim that he is making, then how is it that relativism avoids that self-reflexivity problem?
Yes, he thinks that relativism is not undermined by being only relatively true.
Okay.
And the reason why he thinks it's not, I mean, I'm not saying that his solution is in every way or form without that one can challenge it. I was here most concerned to point out what his view actually is. His view is that relativism is not refuted by being applied to itself. If you apply relativism to itself, you have to accept that relativism is only relatively true. And then he tries to give a rendering of what it means for relativism to be merely relatively true. And that is that it needs as its complement and its corrective, as you will, an absolutist perspective. If the absolutist perspective means something like, never be satisfied with saying, oh, this is just relatively true. Always try to find something which is more than just relatively true. But of course, ultimately, he's willing to bet that that search is never going to be successful. Nevertheless, as a corrective of the relativist maxim, treat everything merely as historically and contextually dependent. As a corrective of that maxim, he thinks absolutism is right to say, no, don't stop. It could always be that the absolute is just one step away. Only, of course, when the absolutist has had his say in that respect, the relativist has his say again and tries to show that whatever the absolutist saw as final, the relativist will again try to show as merely contextual or relative.
Right. Well, I'll have to read some more. Thank you.
It's not easy. I'm warning you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this exchange. And I am jealous about the emails that are going to follow between the two of you.
Oh, yeah. No, maybe I could just send one sentence on our previous exchange, because we were cut off before I could actually answer your second intervention. I hope I remember it now correctly. You asked me whether Simmel is a relativist or is a contextualist. And of course, contextualism, relativism in the contemporary debates in the philosophy of language means different things. So let's just say for the moment, we mean by contextualist something like we have an absolute standard, and this absolute standard determines what in each context is appropriate. When in context 1, do that. When in context B, do that. When in context C, do that. That's not yet relativism. Okay? Simmel is not just saying that.
Okay.
He's something stronger than that. He's saying that there is no such absolute standard from which you can determine what is appropriate in each different standard.
Right. I suppose I don't necessarily take contextualism to make I suppose that is trying to run the metaphilosophical problem with the contextualist and say that the contextualist as a self-reflexivity problem, because it's putting forward an absolute proposition, and the absolute presupposition that it's put forward is that every claim is contextual. But is that what you were saying?
No, I was saying
No.
I was saying the opposite. I was saying that let's take contextualism as an anti-relativist position.
Right.
And then it would amount to saying we have one absolute standard, and that absolute standard determines what is the appropriate judgment or what is the appropriate criterion in different contexts. If that is what we mean by contextualism, then it is clearly not a form of relativism, and Simmel does not hold this form of contextualism.
I guess that's not what I meant by contextualism, but it really doesn't matter. But thank you.
But we should also, be, let's put it this way, we should be a little charitable to our historical predecessors. Obviously, at the time when Simmel is writing, when you had not that much debate about relativism before that. Of course, you had the ancients, and of course, you had a little bit in Montaigne and some early modern philosophers, but otherwise you didn't have a rich texture of relativist debates. So obviously, some of the distinctions that we are inclined to insist on today, be crystal clear to what extent you distinguish between relativism and contextualism, be crystal clear whether you mean it as alethic or epistemic. All these things, people are moving in that direction and that they're getting clear on it, but they don't quite have the conceptual tools that we have today to talk about those issues. So to me, the interest in looking at someone like Simmel is not like, has he formulated a view with such precision that we can take it as such and use it in our contemporary debates, but rather, does he suggest some interesting links between some debates that we have not much paid attention to? So, for example, are there interesting relationships or interesting links to be developed between, say, evolutionary epistemology and coherence theory of justification? Are there interesting links between arguments about infinite regress and arguments about relativism? So that's to me the interest, how suggestive are some of the links that they make between problems that we tend to think of as rather separate, rather than do they have so precise a formulation of a problem that we, for the precision for us, can learn something directly from them. That doesn't seem to me to be the case when Simmel writes about relativism. Let's make it more local. Let's talk about ancient debates over relativism. Let's say Plato's Theaetetus criticism of Protagoras and so on. Right? Let's take that context. Well, first of all, it takes enormous interpretative effort to work out what those positions, what exactly is Plato's position. To this day, it's quite unclear to commentators, and there are big fights in the literature. And I looked into that because it relates to the relativism question, what exactly Plato's position is and what is the position Plato is actually criticizing. Now, the level of debate in Simmel's time on Aristotle's scholarship on that context anyway, on Plato, was not that highly developed. And so the debates, the debates that the medievals had about related issues just wasn't part of the background of the German debate at the time.
No, that's
you had someone like Trendelenburg, who was some kind of Aristotelian of sorts, but it did not feed into this specific debate.
And in any case, we thank you so much for being with us. It was fascinating.
Thank you. I can't hear you.
Gerhard,
Your microphone is on.
Yes, yes. I thank Martin so very much for his talk and this very interesting discussion. And I see that I could take over your interpretation of Simmel to Poincaré. This is exactly very, very similar. My historical interest on Poincaré and your interest on Simmel, naturally, for me on a scientific level, with conventionalism, naturally, which is very, very near to Simmel's, and this little part of geometry to Simmel's relativism. This is not a contextualism, but you have a plurality of equal solution, and you prefer this one or this one. This is relativism.
No doubt. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So thank you very much. I'm very happy about your talk, and I can only thank you, and to Anna for
yes, thank you, Anna. Thank you so much.